You can't replace part of the brain. Like, you
treat them the same.
The source of truth for the medtech industry.
Coexists with the prophets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed it. In the 90s, built $1 billion company that held up high. A lot of things.
State of MedTech with your host, Omar and Khateeb. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. And today's startup founder is a really interesting one, somebody who I've been friends with for quite a long time and I've been wanting to have her on the show, and that's Khateeb Morse. Khateeb Morse is the CEO and co-founder of a company called BrainSpace. You can learn more about them at brainSpacemed.com. So let's talk about it. So first, the thing you need to know is that protecting the brain after injury, stroke, or surgery really starts with managing the pressure and draining the cerebrospinal fluid. Unlike anywhere else in the body where, let's say, we have some injury and the inflammation happens, it has places to grow. There's elasticity involved because of the skin. But with our brain, it's essentially within a hard cavity, which is the skull. And so managing that is super important. What BrainSpace has done is that they developed an automated CSF manager that offers a single drop drainage control, which essentially preserves the gravity-based approach that neurosurgeons trust. And so by combining both precision drainage and continuous ICP monitoring in the same solution, they essentially replace both devices and give ICU doctors and nurses the ability to optimize care for each patient like never before. I think it's a really exciting technology. I love stuff like this because this is where we need the most kind of innovation, which is specifically with our most sensitive and delicate patient population, those who are in the critical care unit. So we talk about her company, the market, and more. So if you're an investor and you're interested to learn more, hit up Khateeb on LinkedIn or go to brainSpacemed.com. Now, a couple other words from some partnerships. Number one is that if you're a CEO or founder, we know how hard it is to find early adopters. More importantly, you have to find the right ones. Using PubMed to find who's published the most isn't the right thing because that may not be the right target for you. And this is where we need commercial intelligence on procedure volume, ICPT codes, and more. And this is why I've used Alpha Sophia myself. Alpha Sophia is a medtech commercial intelligence platform that gives you access to see what physicians are doing, what procedures, what industry engagements they have, what societies they're part of. Plus, the part that I love the most, and this is what I use with my clients, is seeing the contact information, but more importantly, what social media handles they use. So this way you can find the right early adopters that fit where your company is today. And if you want to learn more about them, you can get 3 free reports done for you by going to alphasophia.com/Omar. And you're able to get 3 free researches, see the data for yourself and make a decision. Plus, the best part about it is that aside from a really beautiful user interface that's easy to use, it's very affordable. Their packages start at $300 a month. That's something that every startup can afford. And finally, if you're a startup founder that is struggling with commercial traction, maybe you've already used Alpha Sophia, maybe you need some more help, let Khateeb & Co. help you. We work with a variety of medtech startups to use social media and digital channels to profile your market, target those early adopters, and then help you book more demos with them. We develop a digital pipeline for you in your CRM, and we coach you and your sales team on how to do it. And even if you don't have a sales team, that's okay. Our team can help by taking calls and doing demos as well. So if you want to learn more about how we can get you traction and book more demos to get those early adopters, shoot me a message on LinkedIn or go to khateebandco.com and fill out an application to see if you qualify and book time with us. So with that being said, let's get on to our episode with Khateeb Morse, CEO and co-founder of BrainSpace. Enjoy. Welcome back to the show, everybody. I'm joined by a good friend of mine, somebody who I've known for a long time, and I kept telling, when are you going to come on the show? And she finally came on the show. That's Khateeb Morse, the founder of BrainSpace. Khateeb, thanks so much for coming on the show. How are you doing?
Absolutely. Great to be here and enjoying the conversation.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about your company, which I love the tagline, which is essentially protecting the brain one drop at a time. Before we get into that, maybe a quick, high level, who is Khateeb Morse? What's your background and how did you get into this wonderful world of medical devices?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my career in nonprofits, moved around a lot growing up, had a lot of exposure to different cultures and different countries, and thought I was going to go into State Department eventually. And when I went into nonprofits, I made everybody crazy because I was constantly trying to figure out what I now know to be flywheel effects and ROI and all of that. But at the time was just going, how do we scale these things? And so originally moved into medtech as kind of a temporary stepping stone. There was a good kind of opportunity to make the switch with the experience I had. And I got here and found that I loved it. For me, it's the perfect combination of doing things that can really have an impact and are really meaningful for humanity, but also can have the possibilities to scale, can have opportunities to grow, can have business levers. And so some of the complexities of how you solve the problems we solve in medtech was really appealing. So that opportunity to do the high profit, high impact combination was appealing. And then the fact that every time it's a new problem, right? If you work on a project that's in, my co-founder was in peripheral arterial disease and then was in neurosurgical and then now the critical care, right? So being able to have those different types of problems and getting up to speed on so many different complexities, it's always an opportunity to learn. I love the impact, I love the learning, and I love the solving hard problems with business.
That's fantastic. I love it. And you picked up a really hard problem to solve, which essentially the critical care environment is really difficult. Plus, you're dealing with brains, right? So, talk to us a little bit about, first of all, like, what's the problem that you're solving, and why is it a big problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So the problem we're starting with is really this question of the pressure inside the brain, how you manage it and how you heal it. And the problem is complex and challenging for a number of reasons we can get into. But the basic question is, if you were to twist your ankle would swell, right? Your skin would expand and allow that swelling to happen, and you'd put your foot up and put ice on it. When the brain gets injured, it also swells, but your skull's made of bone, so it doesn't expand the way your skin would. And so you have this swelling happening within this hard shell, means that you have that increased pressure. And so just like with that balloon, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, eventually it's going to pop, right? And what happens in the brain is when you have that increased pressure, you now don't have enough flow from your blood pressure to get oxygen to the nerves. So you have to the blood cells. So you have on the nerve side and on the blood side, you don't have enough. And that's how you end up with brain damage. So when you think about getting a brain injury, so whether that's a motor vehicle accident or a football injury, or even at birth, you can end up with a brain bleed. In all of those cases, what actually causes the long-term damage is the fact that that pressure got too high and you ended up with not getting good oxygen to those blood cells. And so what we are doing is essentially buying time. So if you talk to people in neuro, you'll often hear this phrase, time is brain. The longer the brain goes without oxygen, the more long-term damage, right? And so there are a lot of people working on that problem, whether it's how do we get people to the ER faster? How do we get people to a stroke center faster, right? But the reality is it's not just at that initial point of injury, it's the entire time that brain is healing. So that could be days, weeks in that initial acute period. You need to make sure that that brain pressure is managed. And so the way that's done today, unfortunately, as crazy as it may seem, is with a string level. So if you think about like a bubble level you'd use in your backyard, making sure your fence is level, a similar approach is taken with the brain, where a device is set up next to the head, leveled to the ear, and anytime the patient moves, you've got to re-level, you've got to re-zero, you've got to reset up that whole system. And so that just makes it incredibly labor intensive for the nurses. It makes it pretty miserable for the patients that are conscious, because now they can't move, they can't get up and do anything. Often children end up getting sedated. It can be a very difficult process. But then it also means you've got somebody in an ICU bed for weeks on end, and you've got nurses constantly having to make sure that, a tech didn't come in and adjust the bed to do a procedure, and now they can't get good pressure. And so that can result in over drainage that can cause all kinds of complications, including long-term brain impacts. So the short term is making that process easier. We have a wearable that allows for patients to get up and move around. And then we have a bedside unit that automates the opening and closing of that drain and regulating to the target pressure. So that way, doctors and nurses will be able to manage these patients a lot more effectively. And then really that opens up then a lot of platform opportunities down the line, now that we're in the brain fluid and able to really start to unpack so many different possibilities within neurotrauma, dementia, neurosurgery. There's a lot of different ways we can go from there.
That's fantastic. And I'm wondering, why is it that somebody else hasn't thought about addressing this problem? Like, why is it still the way it is?
Yeah, so I would say there have been a lot of attempts along the way. If you look at the IP landscape, about every few years, a neurosurgeon goes to the biomed group at a university and says, somebody should fix this problem. We're certainly not the first people to propose that the problem be solved. But I think anytime you're going after a technology that's been around for a long time, so the existing devices were developed in 1927, the same year we went from the pocket watch to the wristwatch. Okay, so there's been a lot that's happened in that time, and it's a very basic device. And so anytime you want to improve in that space, there's a lot of questions, not just is this technology feasible, but how does it fit the clinical workflow? Where does it come in on price, right? So there have been some attempts to do this that were just incredibly more expensive. And people said, sure, when you have 5 years of outcomes data saying it's better, then I'll talk to you. But of course, no company can get there first. And then it also comes into workflow. So when you think about critical care, unlike with surgery, where you could say on this procedure, I'm going to use this device, and on this procedure, I'm going to do that device. When I talk to people in critical care, their most common answer is we want one device that's used across all the patients. We want people to be trained on one thing. And so some people have tried to solve this just looking at volume, some just looking at pressure, some just looking at mobility. And really, in this case, it had to be a solution that worked for every type of patient coming in the door, whether that's from a TBI or a hemorrhagic stroke or a diagnostic for a form of dementia that's treatable with surgery. There's a number of different reasons people could end up on a device like this. And so being able to do something that solved for all of those different populations, that was cost effective and that allowed for it to fit into existing workflows. And so being able to solve for that trifecta is a lot more possible now than it was 5-10 years ago because of where technology has gone, sensor technology, memory technology. There's a lot of different things that are now more possible than they were. Wearables have come a long way, but it's also the question of being able to just put all the right pieces together in a way that can be adopted.
That makes a lot of sense. So essentially, you mentioned that what you have is a wearable. Can you kind of describe it, and how does it exactly work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are essentially the external part of the tubing set, and then we have a toaster size device that sits right there at the bed. So we connect where the ventricular catheter exits the skull. So there are a bunch of different ones on market already. Every neurosurgeon has their favorite. We let them keep what they want. We don't mess with that part of it. And where it exits the skull is where we then connect. And so we have the tubing. We have a little 1-inch wearable that sits at the ear, and that becomes our reference. So we don't have to worry about what's on the IV pole or anything else that's going on. That's where all the monitoring takes place. So we monitor what position the head is in. We monitor the pressure all right there. So if you sneeze or cough, your pressure spikes. It's very temporary. It comes right back down, but you see that spike. So if you throw your head forward, I can't tell you if you were sneezing or vomiting, but I can tell you one of the two, and that spike in pressure was not clinical and is not a brain bleed. So there's some additional data that we can collect there. And then the tubing continues down to the bedside unit, and that's what's actually automating the opening and closing. We're able to do single drop precision. So you mentioned the protecting the brain one drop at a time is a bit of a double entendre, because it's actually, we're able to control without using a pump. So it's still a gravity-based system, which neurosurgeons really care about. They don't like the idea of a pump on the brain. So it's still gravity-based, but we're able to have that precision control. So we can drain the exact number of drops that we intend to, and that goes to a pressure or volume target. And so that's really that closed loop system to allow for detect what's going on, act upon it, and then confirm that what you intended to do is what actually happened. Because as we all know, the body is not nearly as predictable as the benchtop. And so being able to have that closed loop behavior allows for this to be fully automated.
So you mentioned that like your main target would be essentially critical care units and ICUs. Is there applications for this in the neurosurgical suite?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of these patients actually get the device first placed in the OR. It can be done at the bedside if the only reason to do it is just for the monitoring and drainage, but often it's alongside other procedures that are being done. So it can be placed in the beginning of the procedure and actually used to manage the levels that are needed during the procedure. So anesthesiologists, for example, are often the ones managing this today. And then it can also be used with spine surgery prophylactically. So there are a number of spine surgeons, if you're doing something with the spinal cord itself, where they want to see that dura healing faster. And that's really where it becomes relevant as well, because essentially if you have a slice in a hose, right, as long as that pressure is flowing, you're just going to be spraying out. There's there's no way that you're going to get that to close up again. But if you can reduce the pressure below what would fill that hose, now you're able to get that to close. And if you're gluing it closed, right? Same thing with the body. So when you have that spinal cord, as long as that pressure is pushing it open, it's really hard to actually get the closure on the dura. And so they'll use prophylactic low pressure in order to create that better healing after spinal cord surgeries.
God, that makes a lot of sense. And so it sounds like what essentially you guys are doing in BrainSpace is digitizing this process, because it's pretty much been done manually and not automated, right?
Yeah, so we're combining multiple. So right now this is 3 different devices that we're combining into one and then digitizing it. And so what that allows for is it allows for closed loop control behavior that wasn't possible when it was 3 different devices and when it was analog. But it also allows us to start building AI ready data sets. And what we mean by that is when you think about all the buzz in AI, right? Everyone's talking about healthcare and AI. At the end of the day, we're physical beings, and all of what is being done to us and all of what's being monitored about us has to have some sort of physical interface. Software can't interact directly with a human without some sort of device. And so whether that's even just a screen, whether it's a monitor, whether it's a wearable, whether it's the phone in your hand, right? And so when you think about, say, Web 1.0, the reason that happened was not just because of website and internet technology. It was also because there were now desktop PCs. And so people were interacting with a computer as part of everyday life, right? Web 2.0 was not just because there was the invention of apps. It was because with a smartphone in your hand, you were interacting with that smartphone way more during the day than you did when you only interacted with a desktop at your desk. And so when we look at the adoption and the major leaps in software development, it's generally accompanied by leaps in hardware development that make the software more present in your everyday reality. And that's a lot of, if you look at like robotics and visualization and VR and AR, and all that is really trying to say, what's the next step in that way, right? How do we make that information even more available? But the other side of that is actually, how do we create that information digitally to begin with? And so every device that's collecting data, if you just collect that data and put it on a screen, now a nurse has to go enter that into the EHR, and then the software has to go try and decipher what the nurse was saying. But if you create AI-ready data from the get-go, what you're doing is you're annotating and labeling that data set. You're structuring it in such an integrated way that it goes straight into the training model. And so right now, if you want to do research on ICP waveforms and how blood pressure and brain pressure and compliance and all these things come together, it's about 8 hours of an MD PhD going and cleaning that waveform. With the BrainSpace device, you'll be able to do that instantaneously, because we will have already labeled we take over 1,000 data points a second, and every one of those is labeled and annotated and integrated. So you're able to use that for training models from the get-go. And so that's really where we see longer term that biomarker enablement platform, where you're able to say, okay, this is a consistent pattern we're seeing among these different types of patients. And that's where research can be done in a much more effective and efficient way than is possible today.
That's fantastic. So, and I really like that concept because, many people have heard me mention it on the show. I really like the idea of new technologies where you have hardware that's enabled through software to automate a process, capture new data, because then through those data streams and those data sets, that's really how you change standard of care, because you've never had that level of data at that, at that such like minute level, yep. Right? And so then from there, like, you're really able to change standards and everything. So I really love that. I love the essentially the progression of what the product can be right now. Like roughly, if like an investor is talking to you and they're asking about like how large the market is, just like, let's say here in the United States, like what can that look like?
Yeah, so the US market for the first product is about $1 billion market if you look at pricing parity, existing devices, existing reimbursement. We're fortunate, and this was part of the strategy in going after this product first, is there is an existing DRG code, existing reimbursement opportunities. So that gets us a shorter path day one. And then if you want to really zoom out and say, okay, global pressure management around the world, what is the need? That actually is over 100 billion. Now, a lot of those places today don't have a solution because they don't have nurses that can handle the analog systems. It's not part of existing budgets, right? So there's a long road to get there. But starting with the US market as it stands today for the first product, it's about $1 billion market.
That's fantastic. And again, like, I do like the progression and the different opportunities you have. You have a very clear like beachhead that you're going to land on, and then other areas to expand. And to kind of shift things, one thing we've had discussions about is you were not a fan of it, I guess, but now you've kind of changed your mind about founder-led sales. Can you talk to us about your journey there, and like what does that look like for you now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say part of that has been the fundraising process. I've enjoyed a lot more than I expected to. So I kind of went into it going, it's a pill to swallow. You got to make it happen. It's how it goes. But I was not really looking forward to doing it. And what I found was I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk with people, to hear kind of the questions they asked and the ways they thought. And there are a lot of really smart people that are having these conversations. And so that was something I enjoyed a lot more. And then I went out and I said, well, I need feedback from users. And we've all seen those companies where they have an amazing co-founder, but they basically got all their input from their one medical co-founder. And then they get out in the market and it's like, oh, that's not how the rest of the market operates. That's not how most people do this. That one person had a soapbox. That's not the normal procedure. And so it was really important to me that we were able to get that really broad range of input. And so we actually talked to more than 200 doctors, nurses, and hospital leaders from more than 100 institutions. And when a few people I've said that to, they're like, wait a minute, not even the big guys to have that many conversations. I was like, well, maybe they're a little less paranoid than we are about making sure we get it right the first time. But it's in that process, I found that I really loved having the conversations with people and talking to them about what their needs were and what the solutions would look like and all of that. And then it was actually one of your podcast episodes. You were talking about the Crossing the Chasm book. And I'd heard people mention it before, but you were kind of going into some of the details on it. And I was like, okay, it's time. I should probably look at this. And as I started to read that book, what I realized was most people sell the way they buy. And you have to understand who you are as a buyer before you can really understand how you sell. And then just because the way you want to be sold to is not necessarily the way people are selling. So I started talking to a bunch of friends I have who are in sales. And I was like, okay, what about this? What about this? And they're like, Caitlin, what are you talking about? Why do you think you don't want to do sales? Why do you think you wouldn't be good at sales? And it really came down to, I didn't like being manipulated. I didn't like people trying to twist my arm into something or emotionally pressure tactics or whatever. If I asked for information, I wanted that information. And one person in particular said to me, doesn't everybody? they were like, most of the people you talk to are going to know more about the procedure than you do, right? I'm not an MD. I have not spent the last 30 years managing these patients. And so they're going to want that information. And so give it to them. You've spent a ton of time having this very detailed, I've read hundreds of papers on the subject. I've spent the last 3 years. I'm the one doing software debugging at 10 p.m. at night. Like, I know how this system works. And so realizing that actually connecting with people, understanding what mattered to them, what they cared about, and giving them the information they needed to make a good decision was what good sales look like, made me a lot more open to the possibility.
No, I love that. And I'm glad you came to that conclusion because in my opinion, when you get somebody to do something that you don't personally believe in, but it's to your benefit and not to that other person's, that's manipulation. But when you do things that are in the best interest of the other person and it actually helps them, that's true sales. True sales is like when you actually help somebody solve a problem. And I always tell salespeople that the most important thing is you have to a lot of people think sales is about hiring a salesperson they can sell to anybody, anytime, any place. And conviction in the product is so important for a salesperson because if you're convinced that your product is the best thing to solve a problem, then you'll go to great lengths to continue to follow up, to just like break down barriers because, like, I really need to make sure that I get this solution into the hands of that prospect because it's going to make their life a lot better. And if you don't really believe that, then that's manipulation,
And I would say it's also helped that in talking to those 200 plus people at this point, almost every person there has been, in general, very excited about the problem we're solving and the way we're going about it. Now, of course, they all had like, okay, well, make sure this button does this, or, can it do that? Or, everyone had feedback that was helpful. But realizing that the more I talked to people, the more they were like, well, sure, yeah, of course we'd love that. But that's not an option. I'm like, well, what if it was, right? People would say, I ask almost every person, what's the most likely reason that you wouldn't get this in your hospital? Like, tell me what barriers I need to overcome. And then, okay, of all the problems you're looking at right now, is this in your top 5 in terms of critical care? And I was doing all that because I wanted to make sure that we were solving the right problems at the product development stage, right? But a lot of those same conversations make it really clear who are the people that are most interested. So in our case, for example, if you're a neurosurgeon who doesn't have a dedicated neurointensivist, you are thrilled about the problem we're solving. If you have a dedicated neurointensivist and you have residents and fellows and all these other people, you're like, yeah, that's a good idea. Somebody should do that. But you're not feeling the pain because you're not the one getting the call at 3 a.m. when somebody's like, I don't know what's going on with this thing. It might be jammed. Can you come look at it? Right? If you're the one that's getting that, you're the one that's getting up in the night. You're the one that's having to come rushing in twice an hour trying to deal with this as a nurse, right? If you're the one feeling that pain, then we've had incredibly positive feedback. And so I think that also helps to kind of understand from the classic ideal customer profile type thinking, but it's really figuring out who has that pain and what it would take to solve it for them has been a fun process.
Yeah, and I think that's important as well as a founder, because I think what, in my personal opinion, for investors, what they're looking for is a founder that's going to be really embrace like harsh realities, right? And not, I think a lot of times founders are looking for somebody who's just a little bit interested in everything versus you're going through the process of like finding out like, is this really a big pain point? Is this the top 5 problems? Because then you're able to get closer to finding the holy grail, which is those early adopters, those innovators, which are, is like a needle in the haystack, and they're not always the same people you think. Some people, I think the big misconception about technology adoption founders have is thinking that, if a physician adopted certain technology in the past, they're going to adopt my thing because they like new stuff. And it's really not the case. If you think about yourself, I'm sure there's things that you bought where you were like part of an early adopter group, like on the consumer side. There's probably other things that you bought that it wasn't until like later on, right? And so even ourselves, we change,
Yeah, and that's actually another thing with, keep coming back to this book, but with what you were talking about with crossing the chasm is that difference between tech enthusiasts and visionaries. So I will say I am not a tech enthusiast. I am sometimes a super early adopter, but it's because I'm on the visionary side. So if a particular problem that I already know I have and I've already been looking for a solution for, something comes up, even if it's super early, I'm like, great, I already know I have this problem. Now there's a solution. I'm in. I will be a very early adopter. But if it's something that I just kind of look at as, okay, there's some cool tech, but I don't really understand what problem it's solving, I know people who are like, Caitlin, look, did you hear about this? Have you seen this? Have you tried this? And I'm like, no. And they're like, you walked right by the store it was in. I'm like, I don't see the value prop. And so I'm really aware that, especially in healthcare, there are some tech enthusiasts. There are some who are just like, here's a new cool gadget. But I think there are a lot more early adopters that are in that visionary category, who are like, these are the problems that are painful enough, that are meaningful enough, that if somebody's willing to solve them, I'm interested and I'm open to it. And I think that's also really important when you're understanding the type of problem. I was just talking with our advisory board the other day, and I brought up an issue that a neurosurgeon I've been talking to was like, hey, you should solve this problem next. And I brought it up and I said, hey, what would it take for this to really matter? And this is really something I learned working in East Africa and South America, looking at a very different risk profile than what we have in the US in terms of what products are available and what products can be used. And then, where does that risk profile fit? It happens in rural America, right? If you're in a rural location, you may not have access to all the latest and greatest tools that the top academic centers have. And so that adjusted risk. And so sometimes people will come in and say, we can do it better. And we're like, yeah, but the solution's already 90% effective. You're going to need to be 99 for anyone to be interested in that technology. Whereas in other case, it's like, well, what we have is only 30% effective. Even if you could just get us to 70%, that's a huge jump, and that would be interesting and relevant. So understanding kind of where you're coming in and what the baseline, how painful it is, but also how much of a solution they have, because sometimes that benefit may not be worth the risk of new adoption. Whereas in other cases, even something you think is not all the way there could still be a big enough difference to matter.
No, absolutely. On the topic of like adoption and barriers to entry, one of the issues that every medtech founder faces is they can have a great solution that's way better than the standard. The problem, though, is that you're always fighting against cost centers within the hospital, right? And so you have to have like a strong economic story. It's great that you guys have a code, but what have been some of the hurdles for you guys to drive adoption within the hospital and in the C-suite?
Yeah, and I will start by saying we are not on market yet. So FDA disclaimer right here, there's no product for sale. But when we've been having those conversations, what has really resonated with people is actually the operations type problems, even before the patient benefit problems. So for example, if you think about during COVID, a bunch of people got their elective surgeries canceled, right? Even if it was something like a taking a sample biopsy for a potential cancer, right? Where you're like, that's not optional, but it was optional in the sense that it could be scheduled. And the challenge is, if you don't have an open ICU bed, you can't do neurosurgery. And so when the ICU fills up, it stops ER from now gets backed up, right? That's how you end up with beds in the hallways and everything else, is because ER can't transfer people up to the ICU. It means surgeries get canceled because there's no ICU bed if there's a complication. And so the ICU can really be a huge bottleneck in hospital systems. And so one of the main compelling arguments for this was, look, if these patients, for not all of them, right? Some of them are going to be complicated enough for other reasons, but some of them are hemodynamically stable. If it weren't for this device, they could go to a step down unit, a lower critical unit. And so in some cases, they're in the trauma ICU and they have to get transferred to the neuro ICU just because of the device that we're replacing. And so it was really initially about, can we free up ICU beds and can we improve some of the flow? Because these patients are often weeks in an ICU bed. How many surgeries could have happened and had, a one night stay and a turnover in that time that are now being delayed? So they really saw it on the clinical operations side as a big benefit. And then when I talked with nursing leadership, they have really struggled with staffing. And that was already a problem pre-COVID. It only got worse during the height of the pandemic. And then a lot of people, as travel nurse salaries disappeared, they kind of went, I just don't know if it's still worth it. And so there's been a big challenge on the neurosurgical side because of how long it takes to train them. And there's been a big problem on the nursing side because of the people looking at the cost benefit and saying, I just don't know if it's worth it. And so whereas it used to be a neuro ICU nurse already had 20 years nursing experience before that person came into the role, there's now nurses only 2 or 3 years out of school coming into these roles. And so there's a lot of concern around quality control and around execution and delivery and all that. But there's also just a challenge of, for a lot of ICU nurses, this device is the one reason they don't feel comfortable floating into the neuro ICU. And so if that's eliminated, and this is as easy to use as an IV pump, then maybe you can actually have more of those nurses crossing over. And so all of that meant that nursing leadership looked at this and said, hey, this could really reduce burnout. This could make it easier to do staffing. And so while we do believe long-term, we're going to have significant impact on patient outcomes, and we aim to be able to work with our early customers and run clinical studies and do all of this to show how we improve patient outcomes, we didn't have to get there day one. We could start day one by saying, this is freeing up ICU beds. This is automating nursing workflows. This is making the job of caring for these patients streamlined. And there's value to that because we're going to be at pricing parity. So take those same dollars you're spending and have a much better experience. And you're going to see, and then you run the studies, right? And you see, okay, shorter length of stay in the ICU, these kinds of things bolster that position. And over time, additional diagnostics and everything else can produce additional revenue. But coming in day one and saying, spend your same money and get a better outcome was a much easier conversation on the clinical operations side.
God, that makes sense. And just kind of round things out, and thanks, again, really happy you came on the show, but just for the investors who are listening, where are you guys? I mean, you're not FDA, you're not commercial yet, but roughly like where you guys are you in like your regulatory pathway? Yeah. And then in terms of your funding, like, are you currently raising and where's the company at currently?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are in the process of doing the final V&V testing that's required for FDA submission. So we'll be submitting here later this year. And that we have a 510K pathway on. So we've got a pretty clear, straightforward, again, starting with the Trojan horse product one, get in the door and do something that's a much more straightforward answer. And we raised a seed in 22 and we'll be raising an A later this year as well.
Fantastic. Well, Caitlin, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Where can people learn more about you? And then for your company, I'm going to direct people to go to BrainSpaceMed.com. That's BrainSpaceMed.com. But Caitlin, for you, where can people connect with you?
Yeah, so website's a great place to learn more. I'm active on LinkedIn. I try and be as active as I can in person when not working on product. So I think I will be next at LSI Europe if people are headed there, or a critical care conference next month. But yeah, in general, looking to be a part of both the medtech ecosystem and what's going on in neurocritical, as well as, you can always find me on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. And yeah, you've been a great founder to follow. I mean, you and I have been friends for a few years now, and just seeing the, your evolution as a leader and as a medtech founder has been really inspiring. And I'm very excited and happy to see that you've kind of embraced this whole idea of like founder-led sales and founder-led branding, So
yeah, I appreciate that. I will definitely say, Omar, you've been a good source of a little push from time to time that, hey, people need to hear about you. People need to know what's going on. I think during our seed raise, we ended up getting some family offices involved who heard about us. And it just made me realize, not everybody that you want to connect with, whether it's a doctor or an investor, is necessarily going to be out there that you can just Google and do the research, right? So my default is to do a bunch of research and figure out who the people are and go after them. But you also have to be out there and be public about what you're doing to make sure that other people can find you. So that's I think one of the things you push a lot of us founders to make sure that we're doing and getting out there, and it's been a good experience for me so far to take that on. So
absolutely. Well, my bias is, we work in the greatest industry in the world, and if anything, I always want founders to be in the best position to attract new money into the industry, and hopefully that new money decides to reinvest in other places. So with that being said, Kelly, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been another episode of the State of MedTech. If you guys haven't already, subscribe, give us 5 stars. We'll see you all next time.
Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.